Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Introduction. It is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper subject matter, which is to say the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as the instrument to get hold of the absolute, or as the medium through which one discovers it. A certain uneasiness seems justified, partly because there are different types of cognition, and one of them might be more appropriate than another for the attainment of this goal, so that we could make a bad choice of means, and partly because cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, and thus without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error and instead of the heaven of truth. This feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness through cognition what exists in itself is absurd, and that there is a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. For if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of the absolute being, it is obvious that the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself, but rather sets out to reshape and alter it. If, on the other hand, cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium. Either way, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end, or rather, what is really absurd is that we should make use of a means at all. It would seem, to be sure, that this evil could be remedied through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works, for this would enable us to eliminate from the representation of the absolute, which we have gained through it whatever is due to the instrument, and thus get the truth in its purity. But this improvement would in fact only bring us back to where we were before. If we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it, then the thing, here the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this accordingly superfluous effort. On the other hand, if the absolute is supposed merely to be brought nearer to us through this instrument, without anything in it being altered, like a bird got by a lion wing, it would surely laugh our little ruse to scorn if it were not with us, in and for itself, all along, and of its own volition. For a ruse is just what cognition would be in such a case, since it would, with its manifold exertions, be giving itself the air of doing something quite different from creating a merely immediate and therefore effortless relationship. Or if by testing cognition, which we conceive of as a medium, we get to know the law of its refraction, it is again useless to subtract this from the end result, for it is not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself whereby truth reaches us, that is cognitioned, and if this were removed, all that would be indicated would be a pure direction or a blank space. Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error set up a mistrust of science, which in the absence of such scruples gets on with the work itself, and actually cognizes something, it is hard to see why we should not turn round and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to whether this fear of error is not just the error itself? Indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth, supporting its scruples and inferences on what is itself in need of prior scrutiny to see if it is true. To be specific, it takes for granted certain ideas about cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and assumes that there is a difference between ourselves and this cognition. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet is something real. Or, in other words, it presupposes that cognition, which since it is excluded from the absolute, is surely outside of the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as fear of the truth. This conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute, One may set this aside on the grounds that there is a type of cognition which, though it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, is still true, and that cognition in general, though it be incapable of grasping the absolute, is still capable of grasping other kinds of truth. But we gradually come to see that this kind of talk, which goes back and forth, only leads to a hazy distinction between an absolute truth and some other kind of truth, and that words like absolute, cognition, etc. Presuppose a meaning which has yet to be ascertained. Instead of troubling ourselves with such useless ideas and locutions about cognition as an instrument for getting hold of the absolute, or as a medium through which we view the truth, relationships which surely in the end are what all these ideas of cognition cut off from the absolute and an absolute separated from cognition amount to, instead of putting up with excuses which create the incapacity of science by assuming relationships of this kind in order to be exempt from the hard work of science, while at the same time giving the impression of working seriously and zealously, instead of bothering to refute all these ideas, we could reject them out of hand as adventitious and arbitrary, and the words associated with them like absolute, cognition, objective and subjective, and countless others, whose meaning is assumed to be generally familiar, could even be regarded as so much deception. For to give the impression that their meaning is generally well known, or that their notion is comprehended, looks more like an attempt to avoid the main problem, which is precisely to provide this notion. We could, with better justification, simply spare ourselves the trouble of paying any attention whatever to such ideas and locutions, for they are intended to ward off science itself and constitute merely an empty appearance of knowing, which vanishes immediately as soon as science comes on the scene. But science, just because it comes on the scene, is itself an appearance in coming on the scene. It is not yet science in its developed and unfolded truth. In this connection, it makes no difference whether we think of science as the appearance because it comes on the scene alongside another mode of knowledge, or whether we call that other untrue knowledge its manifestation. In any case, science must liberate itself from this semblance, and it can do so only by turning against it. For when confronted with a knowledge that is without truth, science can neither merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things, while assuring us that its science is a quite different sort of cognition from that which ordinary knowledge is of no account whatsoever, nor can it appeal to the vulgar view for the intimations it gives us of something better to come. By the former assurance, science would be declaring its power to lie simply in its being, but the untrue knowledge likewise appeals to the fact that it is, and assures us that for it science is of no account. One bare assurance is worth just as much as another. Still less can science appeal to whatever intimations of something better it may detect in the cognition that is without truth, to the signs which point in the direction of science. For one thing, it will only be appealing again to what merely is, and for another it will only be appealing to itself, and to itself in the mode in which it exists in the cognition that is without truth. In other words, it would be appealing to an inferior form of its being, to the way it appears rather than to what it is in and for itself. It is for this reason that an exposition of how knowledge makes its appearance will here be undertaken. Now, because it has only phenomenal knowledge for its object, this exposition seems not to be science, free and self-moving in its own peculiar shape. Yet from this standpoint it can be regarded as the path of the natural consciousness which presses forward to true knowledge, or as the way of the soul which journeys through the series of its own configurations as though there were stations appointed for it by its own nature, that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit, and achieve finally through a completed experience of itself the awareness of what really is in itself. Natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge, but since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, This path has a negative significance for it, and what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely as the way of despair. For what happens on it is not what is ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used, shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth, followed by a return to that truth again after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. On the contrary, this path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge, for which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science fancies it has prepared and equipped itself in their service. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's own deed as what is true. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is in reality the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science. This zealous resolve represents the education simplistically as something directly over and done within the making of the resolution, but the way of the soul is the actual fulfillment of the resolution in contrast to the untruth of that view. Now, following one's own conviction is, of course, more than giving oneself over to authority, but changing an opinion accepted on authority into an opinion held out of personal conviction does not necessarily alter the content of the opinion, or replace error with the truth. The only difference between being caught up in a system of opinions and prejudices based on personal conviction and being caught up in one based on the authority of others lies in the added conceit that is innate in the former position. The skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is, for it brings about a state of despair about all the so-called natural ideas, thoughts and opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's. Ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straight away is still filled and hampered, so that it is in fact incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. The necessary progression and interconnection of the forms of the unreal consciousness will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. To make this more intelligible, it may be remarked in a preliminary and general way that the exposition of the untrue consciousness in its untruth is not a merely negative procedure. The natural consciousness itself normally takes this one-sided view of it, and the knowledge which makes this one-sidedness its very essence is itself one of the patterns of incomplete consciousness which occurs on the road itself and will manifest itself in the course. This is just the skepticism which only ever sees pure nothingness in its result and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. For it is only when it is taken on as the result of that from which it emerges that it is in fact the true result. In that case, it is itself a determinate nothingness, one which has a content. The skepticism that ends up with the bare abstraction of nothingness or emptiness cannot get any further from there, but must wait to see whether something new comes along and what it is, in order to throw it too into the same empty abyss. But when, on the other hand, the result is conceived as it is in truth, namely as a determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen, and in the negation the transition is made through which the progress through the complete series of forms comes about of itself. But the goal is as necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression. It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion corresponds to object and object to notion. Hence the progress towards the goal is also unhalting, and short of it no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. Whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot by its own efforts go beyond its immediate existence, but is driven beyond it by something else, and this uprooting entails its death. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself, hence it is something that goes beyond limits, and since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself. With the positing of a single particular, the beyond is also established for consciousness, even if it is only alongside the limited object, as in the case of spatial intuition. Thus consciousness suffers this violence at its own hands. It spoils its own limited satisfaction. When consciousness feels this violence, its anxiety may well make it retreat from the truth and strive to hold on to what it is in danger of losing. But it can find no peace. If it wishes to remain in a state of unthinking inertia, then thought troubles its thoughtlessness, and its own unrest disturbs its inertia. Or, if it entrenches itself in its sentimentality, which assures us that it finds everything to be good in its kind, then this assurance likewise suffers violence at the hands of reason, for precisely insofar as something is merely a kind, reason finds it not to be good, or again, its fear of the truth may lead consciousness to hide from itself and others behind the pretension that its burning zeal for truth makes it difficult or even impossible to find any other truth than the unique truth of vanity, that of being at any rate cleverer than any thoughts that one gets by oneself or from others. This conceit, which understands how to belittle every truth in order to turn back into itself and gloat over its own understanding, which knows how to dissolve every thought and always finds the same barren ego instead of any content. This is a satisfaction which we must leave to itself, for it flees from the universal and seeks only to be for itself. In addition to these preliminary general remarks about the manner and the necessity of the progression, it may be useful to say something about the method of carrying out the inquiry. If this exposition is viewed as a way of relating science to phenomenal knowledge and as an investigation and examination of the reality of cognition, it would seem that it cannot take place without some presupposition which can serve as its underlying criterion. For an examination consists in applying an accepted standard and in determining whether something is right or wrong on the basis of the resulting agreement or disagreement of the thing examined. Thus the standard as such, and science likewise if it were the criterion, is accepted as the essence or as the in itself. But here, where science has just begun to come on the scene, neither science nor anything else has yet justified itself as the essence or the in itself, and without something of the sort it seems that no examination can take place. This contradiction and its removal will become more definite if we call to mind the abstract determination of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something and at the same time relates itself to it, or, as it is said, this something exists for consciousness. And the determinate aspect of this relating, or of the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. But we distinguish this being for another from being in itself. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing, it is also distinguished from it and posited as existing outside of this relationship. This being in itself is called truth. Just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here, since our object is phenomenal knowledge. Its determinations too will at first be taken directly as they present themselves, and they do present themselves very much as we have already apprehended them.